US President Joe Biden has become the first sitting president to visit a site in Tulsa where hundreds of black Americans were massacred by a white mob in 1921. Now, this year marks 100 years since the destruction of a thriving black community in Oklahoma. The incident is one of America's darkest and long-suppressed moments of racial violence. Biden observed a moment of silence for the victims. President Biden privately met with 3 surviving members of the Greenwood community who saw the violence unfold. Biden said that the country must learn from one of the worst episodes of racial violence.
For much too long, the history of what took place here was told in silence, cloaked in darkness. But just because history is silent, it doesn't mean that it did not take place. And while darkness can hide much, it erases nothing. It erases nothing. Some injustices are so heinous, so horrific, so grievous, they can't be buried, no matter how hard people try. And so it is here. Only with truth can come healing and justice and repair. Only with truth, facing it. But that isn't enough. First, we have to see, hear, and give respect to Mother Randall, Mother Fletcher, and Mr. Van Ellis.
The visit comes right after the White House announced new initiatives to address racial disparities in wealth, home ownership, and small business ownership. Public awareness about the killings in Tulsa has grown in recent years. The incident was not taught in history classes or reported by local newspapers for decades. White residents had killed at least 300 black people, burned and looted their homes and businesses. Nearly 10,000 black people were left homeless. The incident was triggered after a white woman accused a black man of assault. The allegation was never proven. The massacre that followed devastated a prosperous African-American community. Insurance companies did not cover the damages, and no one was charged for the violence and the massacre. The mayor of Tulsa formally apologized this week for failing to protect the black community. The U.S. has had a long history of racism against black Americans. The custodial murder of George Floyd in May last year exposed just some of the realities of the systemic racism and police brutality which is rife in America. Joining us on this broadcast now is WION correspondent Jagruti Dave, joining us live from Washington, D.C. Jagruti, the Tulsa Massacre was one of the darkest chapters in American history, and the echoes of which can still be felt today, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. This, as you mentioned, was an atrocity that has been neglected in education. A lot of Americans don't know about it. And this is what Joe Biden meant when he said that just because history is silent, it does not mean that it did not take place. And I think this marking of this, this act of violence a century ago is very important for members of the Tulsa community who Joe Biden went to visit, the surviving members, many of who are over 100 years old, but also for black people in America who have been protesting about ongoing oppression and ongoing injustices, racial injustices that they have outlined, which include the treatment by the hands of the police, the long-term effects of those injustices. As you mentioned, this was the looting and the destruction of an affluent black district, which lost a lot of money, and a lot of wealth has been lost in that violence, which can be felt in many communities across America today. So those are the sorts of things, the echoes of that sort of historic violence, and not just that particular incident. I think many activists are saying that there have been other such incidents, and the effects of those are still felt by many communities today.
Jagruti, President Biden won the presidency, in fact, with critical support from the black voters. He made fighting racial inequality a key platform of his 2020 campaign. So there is onus on him, there is pressure on him to do more for the black community. And he is pushing for the passage of a police reform bill that bears George Floyd's name. Now, what is this bill, and is that enough, really? Or does the African American community in America need more?
Yes, so Joe Biden was propelled to his position by black voters, and he not in the primaries as well as in the election itself. And so this is something that he has made as a keystone of his policy pledges all the way through as he was running as a candidate and in the early days of his presidency, is to end what he calls the racial wealth gap, and to try to put in place policies that promote racial equality. One of those was the George Floyd Police and Justice Act, Justice and Policing Act, which he had given Congress until the first anniversary of the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis to come to an agreement on. That deadline passed in a few days last week, in May, and so the problem is that this bill is in a deadlock in Congress. There are many Republicans who think that there are some reforms that are too radical, too many restrictions on policing, which they don't agree with. There are some progressives who think that much more needs to be done, many activists who think that much more needs to be done on police reform. Joe Biden himself has said that he doesn't favour measures or policies like defunding the police, which many activists called for during the height of the protests following the killing of George Floyd. So this is an example of the obstacles that the Biden administration faces, despite pledges to promote racial equality and to despite promises to put in place policies to aid the community that helped him to get into the White House.
Absolutely. Jagruti Dave, thank you so much for joining us. The Black Lives Matter protests in America just shows us that the black community, or the African American community, continues to protest and demand rights that they have, isn't it? WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.